I'm on page 2000.
There's not even 2,000 pages in the book. Sassy. All right. Let's go to space. Do any of you ever want to go to space when you grow up?
No.
Does anybody ever have a
die.
desire to go up to space?
I can't go to space. I'll die because we can't breathe.
No. Liam, seriously, put your face on the computer.
Hi.
Hi. Now, stop messing. Good morning, Asher. So nobody has the desire to be an astronaut when you grow up? Really?
No, I can't breathe up there. Miss Creedle, I can't
probably go up there.
How will we go up there? We can't breathe.
Well, the same way astronauts have always gone up there, in a space shuttle, wearing a spacesuit.
But I don't have a spacesuit.
But you will if you grow up and you become an astronaut.
But they don't have enough money to get the spacesuit.
Well, there's different programs that pay for it.
I don't know what you just said.
There's different people that give money into that kind of stuff. But you have to become learn how to fly a plane first.
I already know how to fly a plane, and I crashed it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Did you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, then maybe you're not someone we want to send up to space. You can't fly an airplane.
I flew into a planet and I never came back. This is just me.
Liam, you're so silly. All right. Since the beginning of time, man has been fascinated with God's starry host, the universe. When man is interested in something, he usually wants to see it up close. Right? We all want to see things up close that we're interested in. Zay, put your face on the computer and stop, please. Thank you. For thousands of years, men have dreamed of visiting the planets. So far, no one has ever been to another planet. We've gotten close to Mars, but we've never been actually on Mars. That's still a dream. Nevertheless, man has accomplished a lot in his explorations of the universe. I expect that a lot more will be accomplished in the next generation.
I thought people went onto the moon, did they?
Moon, yes. Planet, no. Now, robots have been on the planet Mars, but an actual human being has not. Right there.
A monkey has been.
I'm on Mars right now.
I don't know, something's leaking out of the bottom of the box.
You're on Mars right now.
Stuff. All right.
Sasha said he's on Mars right now.
You know, sometimes I feel like I'm on different planets.
I'm on Pluto. Maybe. I don't know.
Well, you're not cold if you're on Pluto.
It is cold.
No, remember it said it was heating up. It was doing the opposite of what we thought it would do.
Well, I'm on Pluto and it's already heating up.
Okay. Well, if you're on Pluto, it's awful dark. All right. So underline this first line. People who study ancient history learned that back in the 1200s, the Chinese had figured out how to build rockets, but they did not share how to do this with others. So we come to find out through history that the Chinese were the first ones to figure out how to build a rocket. But they weren't sharing the information. They were keeping it to themselves. Many people tried to make rockets that would blast them up into space. People used dynamite or gunpowder to try to launch rockets into space. They had no success. In the late 1800s, hold on just one second.
How in the 1200s people make a rocket?
Well, you've got to remember other countries have scientists and mathematicians just like we do. And so the same time that we're trying to figure things out, they are too. And they just happened to figure it out first before we did, before Europeans did. Because you got to remember in the 1200s here in America, it was still Indians and wilderness. We were still over in all white people were still over in Europe. Okay. But the Chinese have always been fascinated with the stars and medicine. They have always had an advanced knowledge of that kind of stuff before we have. Because their civilization is so much older than ours here in America, especially not over in Europe, but here in America. So, and they have always had an innate ability to research and figure things out before a lot of others do. It's just the way God made them, really and truly. It's just the way God made them. All right. So underline this next sentence. In the late 1800s, a Russian astronomer, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. I think that's how we say his name, if I'm saying it correctly for the pronunciation.
Tsiolkovsky.
Yeah. I know it starts with a T. You would think you would say the T, but the T is silent for the pronunciation. So Tsiolkovsky. Okay. Believe that a man would need to mix liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen to make a fuel strong enough to allow a rocket to get away from Earth's gravity. So that was the first hurdle that they had to get over when doing their space rocket, because you remember Earth's gravity is pulling you down. That's why we don't float off into the sky, because the Earth's gravity is pulling us down. So they needed something strong enough to push past that pull from Earth's gravity. Well, dynamite, it just blows, right? So what they're thinking is, we need something that doesn't just explode fast. We need something that will push and sustain a long burn to make that force to get past the gravity. So that's why they kept trying different things.
What about gunpowder?
Gunpowder is like the dynamite. When they would load the gunpowder, it just has an explosive effect, and it will launch, but there's not a sustaining. There's not enough force behind it. And to get something enough force behind it, you would have to have a massive amount. Well, then whatever you're launching, it's just going to blow up. It's just going to be destroyed. So they were trying to find something that's not going to destroy, but yet give it the push that it needed to have. Does that make sense? That's why gunpowder and dynamite are not used. So when liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen were discovered, they found that they burned. You could catch it on fire and it just burned like a candle. And so the oxygen, when you first light it, it kind of goes poof. but then it sustains a burn. So that's why when people wear oxygen, they like the nose pieces at their houses. Have you ever been to somebody's house that has to wear oxygen? What's the first thing you're greeted by on their front door? No smoking, right? Oxygen in use, because oxygen is flammable. Okay. I mean, one time my great aunt, she had oxygen and she was smoking a cigarette and she dropped the ash. And as the ash fell, it kind of ignited a little bit. It kind of sparked in her face. So at that point, we had to take away her cigarettes. Of course, she was like 80 something years old. She didn't need to be smoking anyway. But so oxygen does ignite, it does burn. And the hydrogen is what gave it the push and the lasting effect that it needed. So does that make sense? Does everybody understand how the concept of that came around? Okay, good deal. All right, no one tried it until many years later, but it did work. Today we use a very similar mix to blast rockets into space. Underline this next sentence, or next two sentences. Because of this, Przevalsky is called the father of aeronautics. The word aeronautics means the science of space flight. So that's where that word astronauts comes from, this word aeronautics. All right, underlining the next two sentences. Later on in 1919, a man named Robert Hutchinson Goddard studied how a person might get to the moon. He told people that a rocket should be used. Okay, so this Mr. Goddard, he was the first one to suggest, hey, we could put a person in a rocket and get him up to the moon. Well, everyone laughed at him and made fun of him and called him names like Moon Man because they thought it was the strangest and most ridiculous idea they had ever heard. They kept thinking there's no way we can put someone in a rocket and shoot them up into the moon. There's just no way. He made them, but that didn't stop him from working on his rockets. He made them so that they were fast. Underline this next two sentences. They could travel with a speed about 700 miles per hour. Okay, now let me just tell you this. NASA race cars, okay, they can get up to 200 miles an hour. Now, we're talking 700 miles an hour. This is crazy, okay? You're talking as fast as an airplane, okay? This is how fast they're having to get going. And they could go about 1.5 miles into the air before falling back down to the ground. So once they reached that speed of 700 miles an hour, they noticed that the nose of the rocket started to lift. And so this is what made them keep testing it. And they noticed that they could get into the air and they could actually fly for 1.5 miles before it came back down. So, hello, now we've got the right components. We've got the right kind of fuel. We've got the right kind of rockets. So now it's just getting it pointed up and seeing how far we can go. Okay, make sure you underline this next sentence. Remember that our atmosphere is about 800 miles high. Okay, so from Earth, the crust of the Earth, the top of the Earth, through the atmosphere, once you get past the atmosphere, the ozone layer, that is 800 miles. Okay, it's really not that far when you think about it. I mean, come on, 800 miles. I mean, that's like between here and...
That would take them about 1 hour and 10 minutes. What's 700 mile an hour rocket?
Yeah, in the rocket it wouldn't take maybe a little over an hour, hour and 20 minutes maybe. to get that 800 miles. But I mean, if you were to drive it, I mean, you're talking Pennsylvania, maybe, you know? I mean, because it's really not that far if you think about it distance wise. So Goddard had to keep working to make rockets that would get out of the Earth's atmosphere. So he is the father of rockets, Robert Goddard. Okay, underline these next two sentences. About the same time, Germany was in a war and figured out how to make airplanes fly 100 miles per hour and 3 miles up into the air. Man was getting higher into the atmosphere. Okay. So the Germans were the first one to actually put a plane that went distance into the air, but even not only just distance, but it went 3 miles up off of the ground. It wouldn't be long before they sent a rocket into space. In fact, many years later, Russians did just that. Underline that sentence. So Russians were the first one to put something up into space. Can you find Russia on the map? It's a very large country. Many people back then were frightened of the Russians because their country was not free, like the US and other countries were. People could not live anywhere they liked or do what they wanted, what they chose to do in Russia. I can't read this morning. They were told that they could and could not, what they were told what they could and could not believe. At the time, Russian government taught the Russian people to not believe in God. They controlled their lives in a way that frightened free nations. So back then, Russia was a communist country, okay? They dictated where you could work, what you could do, how long you could go to school. They dictated what kind of foods came in and out of the country. They dictated whether you could believe in God, and if you did, you could only go to a certain kind of church. I mean, the whole 9 yards, you know, and every boy out of 16 had to go into the military. I mean, the whole 9 yards. I mean, they just controlled everybody's lives. And so the thought of Russia being the first ones to take control of space, it really frightened everyone else because we didn't want our countries to become like that, right? So it really put other countries a fire under them to get this figured out quickly. All right, so let's talk about the first satellite that went to space. Sputnik. Sensation. That's how you say that. Sputnik. The Russians used a lot of ideas that the Germans developed during World War II to make a rocket that would launch into space. Okay, underline this sentence. The rocket's job was to put the first artificial satellite called Sputnik into orbit around the Earth. Okay, so the Russians, they used a lot of the German technology and they figured it out, and they put an artificial satellite into space first. This was the first rocket to go to space, and Sputnik became the first artificial satellite. Okay, artificial meaning that someone built it. It's not a natural satellite like the moon. Okay, that's why they keep articulating that artificial satellite. The US and other countries were worried about this Russian rocket because many countries were not friends with Russia. Many nations were scared that Russia might become very powerful indeed, taking over the whole world with such amazing advanced technology. Underline this next two sentences. As the U.S. was scurrying about to build a rocket of its own, Russia put another rocket into space. Sputnik 2 was even more amazing because it carried a little dog into space with it. The dog was named Laika, which means barker in Russian. So this little dog named Laika apparently is a barker, likes to bark, was the first breathing thing that went to space. Poor puppy, all by itself in a rocket. The cabin Laika lived in was pressurized. This means it had an artificial environment with oxygen and heat. Okay? So underline that.
The dog?
Huh?
Did the dog die?
Not up there. It died when it came back.
Why?
I can't remember. But I remember last year when we were talking about the American history and we got to this part in the 60s, we were learning about it, that they were talking about the dog, that it was fine while it was up there. But I think it developed cancer or something when it came back and it passed away. So,
So goodbye, dog. Poor thing.
But they wanted something large enough that it could have real meaning, a real, how do I put it? They didn't want to put like a small animal in there because then it wouldn't represent the capacity like human lungs. Okay, dogs have big lungs, like especially bigger dogs. So they wanted a big enough dog where his lungs capacity was close to humans. And so that's why they picked, it was a French bulldog. Do you know what those dogs look like? The French bulldogs? Do you know the Target, that little dog that's Target, it's white, has the black eye? They can get pretty big. I mean, some of them say kind of petite, but the male ones, they can get, they get pretty big. And so they wanted something that had some serious lung capacity. And so once they did that, actually the next thing that went up to space was a monkey. That's when they sent a chimpanzee up. Because again, they're trying to get something close to what humans are going to be able to breathe and do. And so they sent a monkey up next. And it lived. It came back down. But these were short trips. These were just trips up into the atmosphere and back down. This wasn't something that like stayed up there.
Miss Cradle?
Yeah.
I wonder if they put the monkey in a cage.
I think they strapped him to the seat. So, and it was a pretty small rocket. It wasn't like human size where you could stand up and walk around in it. So, that made a difference.
How did he get the rocket if it's come crashing down?
Okay, so from what I understand is when they make the rockets, it comes
parachute.
Right, it comes in pieces. It's built in pieces and sections. Excuse me. So the bottom part that has what's called the thrusters, the actual rockets, those shoot them up through the atmosphere. And once they get through the atmosphere, those fall away. Okay, so you're just left with the actual tube of the space shuttle. Now, the space shuttle is then divided into two parts. It has the nose part and then it has the body part. Okay, the body part is where they live and experiment and do all kinds of stuff. Sasha, are you listening to me through that headset? Sasha, can you hear me? Can you? All right. And then the nose part is the actual seats where they drive the rocket. Okay. But you also have to remember that NASA, the NASA center, was able to drive the rockets, the space shuttle as well. So when they sent the dog and the monkey up, humans here on Earth were controlling the space rocket. And so they sent it up and they basically made it turn around and come back down. And once they did that, the shuttle part of it came off of the nose. So you just had this like triangle looking thing, cone. Okay, it looked like a cone. And so as it came through the atmosphere, they had to build it to where it would sustain the heat. So it was real thick shielding. And once it got through the atmosphere, that's when the parachutes would release and set it down. And they always set it down in the ocean. They always set it down in the ocean. As far as I can remember, I've never, except for the one Challenger space rocket that blew up in actual launching. They always set it, the shuttle down in the nose part of it down in the ocean. And there's always a ship nearby, a carrier, and then they'll send out a rescue boat to get them. But that's how they get them back. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's, for as far as I know, that's my knowledge of how they get up and down out of space. Okay. All right. So that means it had an artificial environment with oxygen and heat. Underline that. So we know that he lived. He was able to breathe and that he didn't freeze. Before Laika went to space, many scientists believed that living creatures could not survive without gravity and the protection of our atmosphere. So they were real scared that once they got up there that he wasn't going to be able to live outside of Earth's gravity. Laika showed the world that living things could survive in space. The Russians were really doing amazing things. Okay. Next paragraph. Sputnik created a big problem for the United States and other free nations. Underline this next two sentences. They were afraid of Russia getting too much power and taking over the world. In response to all the Russians were doing, the U.S. began putting together a big space program to try and get ahead of the Russians. Underline the next sentence. They called this the space race between U.S. and Russia. This is what started all that we know today about space and space travel. Underline this next sentence. Just a few months after Sputnik, the U.S. launched Juno 1, a rocket carrying a satellite called Explorer 1. Phew! Finally, a nation beside Russia had a satellite too. Underline this last sentence. A few months later, NASA, which means the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was born. Okay? So that's where NASA came from. Out of this desire to put a satellite. Callie, are you okay, honey? You got flies? Swatting at flies? All right. Let's read the 1960s. And then we'll stop at International Space Station. You guys can read the rest tomorrow. The 1960s. Now, believe it or not, this was before I was born. I wasn't born until the 70s. But I do remember learning about this when I was in school. So, the 1960s were known for great discoveries in astronautics science, the science of spaceflight. The Russians put an actual human being in space in April of 1961. Please underline that sentence. Underline the next sentence. The Russians called this man a cosmonaut. Okay? The next sentence. A month later, the U.S. sent Alan Shepard into space, and Americans called him an astronaut instead of a cosmonaut. So underline that too. So Russians called their astronauts cosmonauts, and we call our astronauts astronauts. Okay. When Shepard got back to Earth, the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, decided that the U.S. would try to put a man on the moon. Underline that sentence. No one laughed at him the way they did Goddard 40 years before. But underline this next sentence. 8 years after President Kennedy publicly stated his desire to put a man on the moon, an Apollo spacecraft sent Neil Armstrong to the moon. Okay, so Alan Shepard was the first guy in space. Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon. Okay. The United States had finally done something first. They were very excited. Do you know what Neil said as he stepped on the moon? Underline this next sentence. He said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Hold on one second. All right. So that's a picture of what the moon looked like with Neil Armstrong after he had planted the flag. See how the flag is straight out? That's because there's no gravity. There's nothing to pull it down. So all it does is it naturally stands straight out. Isn't that cool? And his feet print are still there on the moon because there's no atmosphere, so there's no wind or rain to wash them away. So his feet print are still in the dust of the moon up there to this day.
That's a
In
lot
the
of
flag?
footprints.
Huh?
That's a lot of footprints.
It's a lot of footprints. You're right. But isn't that amazing to think that his feet print are still there to this day? You're talking 1960s. Okay.
Even the flag is up there?
Yes, the flag is still up there and everything.
What if a crater hits the flag?
Well, I mean, at that point, then it's gone. We'd have to go put another one. But I mean, 1960 to 2000 is 40 years. And then from 2000 to from 2000 to 2020, that's another 20 years. So you're talking 60 years this flag and his feet print are still on the moon. That's amazing. Ooh. All right. Underline the next 3 sentences in the next paragraph. The United States beat the Russians to the moon, but the Russians beat the Americans again a few years later by building the first space station. The Russian space station was called Salyut. What is a space station? It's a giant satellite that people can live in. So make sure you underline those things. Okay?
Isn't that what we have to make for our science test? The space station?
Yes.
So it's like a satellite.
Okay. It does look like a satellite, but it's much, much bigger because it has living quarters, like little hotel rooms in it for people to live in.
Okay.
And then it has a common area for people to come and eat, like a big cafeteria. Yes, Callie?
You know what time we're getting off?
Well, I said we were going to stop at the International Space Station, so I don't know, another 10 minutes maybe? Okay. It also has rooms for science experiments, like little science labs. Okay. So it's not just equipment inside. You know, there's living spaces. So that's why it's so big. Space stations they're really big. All right. Let's keep reading. The living area on these first space stations were smaller than many people's closets. Many of these small space stations were built and sent into space by the Russians and the Americans. Some were a success and some were unsuccessful and fell apart while on their way into space. Many years later, the Russian government fell apart and the US was no longer in a space race with them. Americans and Russians are now friends and help one another learn about space and aeronautics. Underline these next two sentences. Space stations are a great way for scientists to study space. The space stations orbit around the Earth so quickly that they can look at much of the universe in a few hours. Okay? So these space stations, they rotate and they ride around up in space a whole lot faster than anything else. In fact, night comes about every hour on the space station. That means space station astronauts get to see the side of the Earth having night and the side of the Earth having day in about 2 hours. They go from one side of the Earth to the other side in 2 hours. That's pretty fast. Underline this next sentence. The greatest and most important use for space station is that science experiments can be done in space. I'm sure you're wondering why someone would want to do experiments up in a little space station rather than right here on Earth. Underline this next sentence. The reason is that when experiments are done without the influence of gravity, the results are different. So our gravity affects scientific experiments. Up there in space, it's a whole different thing. So that's one of the reasons why they wanted room in the space station so they could be able to have science labs and be able to do different experiments up there. Gravity affects everything: how plants grow, how fire burns, how germs spread, how chemicals mix together. The experiments done on the space station help us better understand how things work in the absence of gravity. This helps scientists make better medicine, equipment, products, and even toys. I bet you didn't know that NASA makes toys. NASA science has led to lots of toys. Underline that sentence. Because
I
NASA...
have a NASA toy.
Huh?
I have a NASA toy.
Do you have a NASA toy?
Yeah.
Yeah. When Garrett was little, and we went to Washington and we went to the Space Center, Smithsonian up there, they had a bunch of NASA toys and he picked one out too. Because NASA understands how to make things fly well, a toy company hired them to build a toy glider that would go a long way before hitting the ground. NASA did a good job. NASA also developed the controllers that many children use to play video games on their TV. So underline, a toy company hired them to build a toy glider, and underline, NASA also developed the controllers that many children use to play video games. These controllers are just like the ones used to fly spaceships to the moon. Space stations are pressurized with oxygen, heat, air conditioning, electricity, and many of the comforts of Earth. Underline that sentence. Inside the space station, the astronaut or cosmonaut doesn't have to wear a spacesuit. He is protected from the harsh environment outside. It's just like a home away from home. All right. So we will stop there. And you guys